Good morning. It's wonderful to see you all. It's a rainy morning outside, but I know this morning we'll have the warmth of being in community together. It's so wonderful to be with you all. Welcome to Washington Hebrew Congregation and to the Amram Scholar Series. I'm Rabbi Susan Shankman. I look forward to this morning's presentation, which we bring to you in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. Today's Amram Scholar Series is sponsored by the Dr. Alan and Catherine Schwartzberg Jewish Studies Endowment Fund. And we're so grateful to their children, Rob Schwartzberg and Shauna Schwartzberg-Brayton, and her husband John, who are here with us today, for their continued support of our Amram Scholar Series, and in particular for sponsoring the brunch that we enjoyed prior to this program. Many of you know that our beloved temple president, Lou Weiner, now of blessed memory, loved attending the Amram Scholar Series. It's one of the things that he discovered during his presidency. He knew about it, but he actually started coming, and he created the Bagels with Lou to provide opportunities for congregants to connect and build community on these mornings. And we're grateful to Rob and Shauna on this morning in particular for making it possible for us to gather and honor Lou's memory in this meaningful way, even as we honor their parents through this morning's lecture. And we were talking beforehand about being and connecting with Lou at the lecture that they sponsored last year with Martin Indyk, and having that opportunity beforehand and how meaningful that was. And so I know that as we are in here this morning, that we are truly honoring Lou's memory in the most important of ways, in being in community and connecting with one another, in learning, and what we call Torah Lishma, Torah for the sake of learning, learning for the sake of learning. Dr. Alan and Catherine Schwartzberg, of blessed memory, made Jewish contributions to the advancement of mental health treatment, biblical archaeology, Jewish history, the Holocaust, and the history and culture of Israel. There's a lot more that we could say about their professional accomplishments, which is certainly interesting to me, and I know to Rob and Shauna, but to many of you as well. Among them, Dr. Schwartzberg's professional accomplishments included serving as chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Suburban Hospital. He was a clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University, a visiting professor at Harvard Medical School, and a captain in the United States Air Force. I always love that last one because my father is a retired captain of the United States Air Force as well. They were both involved here at Washington Hebrew Congregation. In 1966, the year that Shauna was consecrated at WHC, Dr. Schwartzberg spoke at the WHC Saturday Parents Institute on the topic of communication problems in adolescence. So thank you again to Rob and Shauna for this morning and all the ways that you support learning and intellectual advancement and study here at Washington Hebrew Congregation. You honor the memory of your parents with all that you do, with all that we're able to do, thanks to your generosity. The Amram Scholar Series offers a stimulating program of free lectures throughout the year in which world-renowned speakers, authors, scholars, political leaders, policy analysts, journalists, theologians, and more share their perspectives on timely issues or their research into history. The program traces its beginnings to the fall of 1954, when the congregation moved to our Macomb Street home. So you can do the math. We are going to be celebrating in this coming year. We're celebrating our 70th. I did the math correctly. That fall, participating in a nationwide celebration marking the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in the United States, Washington Hebrew launched what would become this widely recognized Sunday morning lecture program. This morning, we have the opportunity to hear from Christopher Gorham, who will share a bit about his book, The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America, after which we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers, for Q&A and conversation. And at the conclusion of our program, Mr. Gorham will be signing books. Again, we're grateful to the Jewish Book Council and the Dr. Alan and Catherine Schwartzberg Jewish Studies Endowment Fund for helping to make this program possible. So I would like to tell you a little bit about our author. Christopher C. Gorham holds degrees from the University of Michigan, Tufts University, and Syracuse University College of Law. After practicing law for over a decade, for the last several years, he has taught modern American history at Westford Academy outside Boston. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, Paper Brigade Daily, and online publications. The Confidant is his first book. He and his wife, Elizabeth, live in Watertown and Chatham, Massachusetts. So to bring us into the story, we're going to turn to our screen first, and then we welcome Mr. Gorham. So please join me in welcoming him. And we're going to start on the screen.
The New York Times called her one of the most influential women in the country's public affairs for a quarter of a century. Life magazine said she was far and away the most important woman in American government. Her name was Anna Rosenberg, and her story has never been told before.
I came over here from Budapest when I was 8 years old.
She made her own way in a man's world.
They were amazed, they were shocked, they were troubled, but I must say most of them were just a little bewildered.
She was invited into the circle of a couple named Franklin and Eleanor.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
And became an advisor and confidant to a president in peace and war.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
As the Cold War exploded into conflict, she was named to the highest position any woman had ever held in the American military.
Mrs. Rosenberg, wartime envoy of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, will add...
Then, Joe McCarthy targeted her as a communist.
Where a communist is concerned, she is not a free agent.
That's a goddamn lie.
The Confidant. Coming March 2023.
I want to thank Rabbi Shankman and the Washington Hebrew congregation and the Schwartzberg family, Robin, Shauna, for having me here today to talk with you all. Thank you all for being here on another beautiful sunny Sunday. It's been about as sunny in Boston. No, I'm just kidding. I was on a sabbatical over the fall to do a book tour, and my wife and I we'd never been to Texas. We went to Texas, it was overcast. We went to Palm Beach, it was overcast. We went to Antibes, France, which is sunny for 300 days out of the year, and it was so rainy that like school buses were falling off the roads. So it gets worse. My wife went to Scottsdale, Arizona with her girlfriends from college, and it rained. It never rains in Scottsdale, so I'm used to it now. It's been a difficult 7+ months and since October 7th, and I know it's a difficult personal time here for the congregation, but I hope that this is an hour of positivity as we learn about this remarkable woman, Anna Rosenberg. She started as Anna Lederer. This is her in the middle of the photograph. Like so many thousands of Jewish families, the Lederer family had reason to leave Eastern Europe, their home. In this case, it has to do with her father, the man with the white cap. Albert Lederer was a successful businessman who provided furnishings for Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in 1910, he appeared at the palace to do the installation, and without a reason why, the emperor broke the contract. And in an instant, Albert Lederer realized his economic future was not going to be in Budapest, and his business was essentially ruined in an instant by the caprice of this emperor. So he sailed for New York. It took him 2 years to get his life back on track, his business rebuilt in New York City. And in those 2 years, Albert Lederer became what Anna called later a fiercely patriotic American. He was learning English, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. When the flag was, fluttering above, it would bring tears to his eyes. And most importantly, he was sort of soaking up the idea that this adopted country of his, in this country, an ordinary person could make change, could have a voice that would be heard, as opposed to the imperial way of doing things. In 1912, he was able to summon for his 2 daughters and wife, and they arrived in that year. The classic American story, on a ship from Europe, under the Statue of Liberty. Their first stop was in the Bronx. Anna was enrolled in the New York public schools in that borough. Again, learning English and trying to dress in a way that kids wouldn't make fun of her, because when they first arrived, they had traditional Hungarian dresses made. But it wasn't too long that Anna got the hang of it. Life in New York was going to be very different. As her father had shown her, she wanted to be engaged in the issues of the day. The first was women's right to vote, women's suffrage. So even as an adolescent and a teenager, Anna Lenner did what she could for women's suffrage, which meant at the time marching along with tens of thousands of other women in columns of women along the avenues and boulevards of New York City for the women's right to vote. And the other event, of course, was America's entry into World War I in 1917. As a teenager, Anna did what she could, which meant selling Liberty bonds from a booth. I did the math for the book. She sold over $100,000 in today's currency of Liberty bonds to help support the war effort. And moreover, she, as you can see in this photograph, she and her sister, Anna's in the foreground, volunteered as Red Cross nurses. Anna was 17 years old in 1917, and she found herself in the pages of the New York Times for the first time. She would be in the New York Times for the next 7 decades until she died in 1983. What got her in the New York Times was the boys' school, the high school boys wanted to go on strike because they didn't want to go to a full day of high school and then go to compulsory military training for World War I. So they did what people did back then, is they went on strike. So they heard that there was a girl at the girls' school who was a good mouthpiece, who could stand up and address people in a successful way. So they had her do that. So Anna Lederer, as a 17-year-old, mediated her first labor mediation between the city of New York and the boys' school, and that got her in the pages of the New York Times. It would not be the last time. In 1919, Anna married a veteran of World War I, a man named Mike Rosenberg. Now, when I was doing the research, very, very scant information on Mike Rosenberg. What we know is he was a veteran of World War I. Reading between the lines, one can sense that he maybe had unseen scars from that war. Very, very quiet guy. But when they got married, they were a happy young couple, and they had a son in 1920 named Thomas. Now it was time for Anna Rosenberg to figure out what she was going to do for a career. And she met 2 incredibly important people at this juncture in her life. The first is Belle Moskowitz. Belle Moskowitz was like the de facto chief of staff of the governor of New York, a guy named Al Smith. She was doing something that virtually no woman in America was doing at that time, which was drafting legislation. She was writing up laws. She was the governor's gatekeeper. She was exercising power that virtually no other woman in the country was able to exercise at this moment, and she was doing it all behind the scenes. She hired young Anna Rosenberg to work on Jewish philanthropies and was impressed by the young woman. She not only could speak German and Hungarian, but she was marvelous with large groups of people. After one of these jobs, Belle Moskowitz sent Anna a check, a substantial check. Anna sent it back, thinking that what she'd done was gratis. Belle Moskowitz sent it back to her and said, "Young lady, if you don't value your work, nobody else will." And she moreover said, you're really good with large groups of people. Maybe you should do what I've done, is open up a public relations firm and maybe do some labor mediation. So that's what Anna did. She started modestly in an office in Brooklyn, but over time gained client after client. The other important person that she met was a very different character. Old Irishman named Jim Hagan, tough, bare-knuckled. He was giving a speech against the women's right to vote when Anna and her girlfriends walked in the hall. Anna waved away the cigar smoke. After hearing enough, from the back of the room, she stood up and sassed this guy. And instead of being angry with her, he called her up at the end of the talk and met her. And then he mentored her for the next 3 years on the retail politics of New York City. how to make dozens, hundreds of phone calls, how to thousands of phone calls, how to knock on hundreds of doors to get your issue acted upon and your person elected. Now, Anna did not go to college. She did not go to grad school, but she had this political mother and political father that really gave her, if you will, indulge me, a master's education, a master's degree in the retail politics of New York City, and her classroom was the great city of New York. With this information, with this tutelage behind her, Anna Rosenberg, you can see on the right, became one of the first women in American history to manage political campaigns. Not to fundraise, but to manage them. And it wasn't just Albany, it wasn't just aldermen. These were U.S. congressional campaigns. This particular candidate, Theodore Pizer, was a U.S. congressional candidate, and of course he won. We don't know what Anna is saying to this group of women at the time, women voters. I like to think it's something along the lines of, women, we now have the right to vote. Let's go out and get our issues acted upon. One newspaper called this young woman, this young mother, this young businesswoman, who always made time for politics because that's what her father had taught her. One newspaper called her at this moment the busiest woman in New York. But the most important people that she met at this time, she met when she was 28 years old, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. Anna was at a Democratic tea in 1928. She's 28 years old. She meets Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt says, "Young lady, what do you do for a living?" She says, "Well, I do some public relations, some labor mediation, and I always make time for politics." Eleanor says, "Well, I'd like you to meet my husband. He's running for governor of New York." Days later, Anna Rosenberg found herself on the steps of the Roosevelt Townhouse in New York City. Days after that, she was on the team, running for governor, along with characters like Francis Perkins, Louis Howe, and Jim Farley. This, I would argue, I argue to my high school classes in suburban Boston, is maybe the most important election in modern American history. Because, spoiler alert, Roosevelt's not going to lose another election. And what he did after 9 months of being governor, when the Great Depression, the curtain of the Great Depression fell across the state and the country, what he did was something that nobody else was doing. Not one politician around the country was doing what he was doing, which is having an energetic response to the catastrophe. Dozens of pioneering programs, government programs, put millions of New Yorkers back on their feet. He pioneered hydroelectricity for the state of New York, among many, many other programs. And this made him the leading candidate in 1932 for president. He was elected president, of course, in that year, and he scaled up what he'd done in New York for the nation, and he called it the New Deal. And he knew that he needed officers for his New Deal army, and he also knew he had a good one in Anna Rosenberg. Roosevelt made her the only woman regional director of not one, but two massive New Deal programs, the second of which was Social Security. Now, she didn't have a degree, she never opened a law book. She had dozens of lawyers under her command, dozens of field offices. She signed up 6 million New Yorkers to Social Security. She would have elderly ladies say to her, "Well, I can't tell you my real age because my husband doesn't know my real age." She would say, "Uncle Sam and I will keep your secrets." What's all the more remarkable is these policymakers in Washington had conjured up these programs, but it was up to people like Anna Rosenberg, who at this time was 35 years old, to get it rolled out at the street level. And what's all the more remarkable is this had to work for Roosevelt. His home state was the Empire State. If this doesn't work in New York, how are you going to sell it to Ohio or Wyoming? This had to work. And it's just remarkable to me that he entrusted it to Anna Rosenberg. That was the level of trust that they had. In this picture, she's not wearing a hat, but she was known for these very elaborate hats. That was her style trademark. President Roosevelt loved to tease her about these hats. In 1938, she was in Washington for a meeting of the directors of the Social Security program, and the president wheeled into the meeting, and he said, "Now, Anna, that's a very fine hat you have on today, but I can't tell if you're coming or going." And she said, "Well, Mr. President, that's because it's a New Deal hat." In the summer of 1941, the president knows, this is 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the president knows that war is on the horizon. Many Americans do, and certainly the defense industries do. They're already building the tanks and the planes for our allies and for the Americans. The problem at this moment is that these jobs, which were good paying jobs, were only being given to white Americans. The black leader of the day, a man named A. Philip Randolph, said in the White House, "I will march for equality, and I will bring tens of thousands of marchers with me." Even Eleanor Roosevelt was sympathetic with this, but the president was in a tremendous bind. He knew he needed Southern lawmakers to support the war effort, to support the war that he knew was going to draw on the United States. He also knew that these lawmakers would grant no concessions to the black leadership. Luckily, he had an ace mediator in his Rolodex, Anna Rosenberg. Over the 2 weeks in the summer of 1941, he ordered her to be at every meeting between the White House and the black leadership in New York and Washington. After 2 weeks, the last meeting was at the White House. Anna thought she drafted up a mutually agreeable executive order, but she needed the president to sign it. That's where Eleanor comes in. Eleanor said, "Now, Anna, why don't you go down to one of those boutiques of Georgetown and buy yourself one of those fancy brand new hats? Get the confidence up and come back and get the president to sign it." And that's what she did. She came back after that shopping excursion. She walked into the Oval Office and she pulled out the draft executive order. She said, "Sign it, Mr. President, sign it." And he listened. Historians consider Executive Order 8802, with the insisting on equality of defense hiring and a watchdog provision. They consider this the first federal action on civil rights since Reconstruction. By 1942, Roosevelt was calling Anna Rosenberg his Mrs. Fix-It. Now I know Fixer has been in the news recently, but this is not quite the same thing. Anna Rosenberg was crisscrossing the country, putting out this fire and that fire and another fire for the president as we were fighting a war on two fronts. I'll give you a recent example, and I'm going a little bit off my script, so bear with me. But my wife and I have been watching Oppenheimer. It's taken us, she falls asleep after about 5 minutes, so it's taken us a couple of episodes to get through it. I love it. I think it's wonderful. One of the characters in Oppenheimer testified later that they were going to unionize, which was a public, if you wanted to unionize, it was just a public process. You can't have a public process when it comes to the Manhattan Project because it'll blow the cover off the project. Roosevelt had to send somebody to get this unionization effort stopped, and he sent Anna Rosenberg. And Eleanor said, "How can you do this? You are a pro-union. That's who you are. You're a new dealer." And the president said, "This is an issue of utmost national security. You have to go do it." So she did. So that's one of the, she's going around and fixing things, putting out fires. She actually convinced the union leaders to stand down. And they said, "What's your argument?" She said, "I don't have an argument other than the goodwill of the president, that you know who I am, that I am pro-union, and it's utmost national security." So she had this, in addition to sending tens of thousands of New Yorkers to the Tennessee and Washington, she had that role to play in the Manhattan Project. The other problem that Roosevelt had to go out and fix had to do with the arsenal of democracy. Now we think today the arsenal of democracy is like a light switch. I think there's a tendency to think that at least. We turned on a light switch and the arsenal of democracy just worked. Chrysler built planes, Ford built tanks, and everything just worked well. That wasn't quite how it transpired, because in 42, the labor situation was, quote, dire. And I'm using Eleanor Roosevelt's quote that she used in the newspapers. The problem was there were too many workers in New York, surplus. There were too few workers in places like Portland, Oregon. The government officials had not yet done the logistics that would allow women workers to come on board in great numbers. For instance, lack of good child care, for one instance. There was absenteeism, there was alcoholism, there was worker piracy between the airplane manufacturers who were they had big windows that were well lit, and in steel yards that were lousy places to work. And of course, the airplane manufacturers had women workers. So men would go from the steel mills where they were needed to the airplane companies. This all had to be fixed. The hardest hit location was Buffalo, New York. Buffalo built everything. Tanks, planes for the Allies, planes for the Russians, planes for the Brits, planes for us. Tanks, medicine, parachutes, belt buckles, they built everything. They were nearly 100,000 workers short. Roosevelt said to Anna Rosenberg, "I'm going to make you the labor czar of Buffalo. Go fix it." She got to work. She realized more women were needed, not just single women, married women, women with children, grandmothers would have to put on the bandana and the coveralls. But Buffalo hadn't done any of the logistics. So Anna did that. She got good quality health care. She had the city's parks lit, heated, and open 24/7. She had the movie theaters run day and night. And most importantly, she had a place for these women to cash their check that wasn't the tavern when they got off their shift at 3 or 4 in the morning. Tens of thousands of women took these jobs. They punched in and they punched back. When Buffalo said to her, we're only going to hire black Americans for porters and painters and menial tasks, she said, no, this is no time to have our caste system on display. We're trying to fight fascism abroad. So they listened. Americans with disabilities took 2,000 of these jobs, and even high schoolers picked up some of the shifts. They leave high school early and take some of these jobs. She came up with nearly 100,000 workers. Time magazine called it the Rosenberg Plan, which also involved moving surplus workers where they were needed. Other magazines and newspapers called it the Buffalo Plan, and that's what history calls it, the Buffalo Plan. Without it, the arsenal of democracy would not have been able to fire on full bore. Here's how it worked. Liberty ships are these massive ships that ferry material across the Atlantic. They're 477 feet long, nearly 60 feet wide. The first one took 131 days to build. After the Rosenberg Plan, or the Buffalo Plan, was instituted and the New Yorkers were on the docks of the West Coast, the keel of the Robert E. Peary was laid on Sunday. It set sail 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later. A woman was there to sponsor the ship, and she arrived too late. A dock worker yelled out, "Just keep standing there, ma'am. There'll be another one along in a minute." When Roosevelt was a young man at the Navy Department, President Woodrow Wilson sent him to the trenches of World War I to see the travails of the doughboys then serving. In 1944, in an extraordinary decision, when it was his turn to send a personal representative to war-torn Europe, he chose Anna Rosenberg. She arrived in France just weeks after D-Day. In fact, it was so soon after D-Day that the troops had not yet broken out of the hedgerow country. Over 6 weeks, she was embedded with Patton's army as it crossed France, liberating town, village, and city. And she saw what the men were seeing: dead Americans, dead enemy, orphans, widows, ruined cities and villages. She was not sent there by the president to be a VIP. She was sent there to find out from the GIs themselves what they dreamed of, what they hoped for should they be lucky enough to return after the war to America. In over 6 weeks, as she discussed, talked to these guys as they crossed France, eating rations off the hood of a Jeep, listening to these men as they pulled sweethearts out of helmets, she wrote it down in a series of notebooks. And what they were telling her surprised her, as it would later surprise the president. What these men wanted was a college education. Sure, they wanted job training. Sure, they wanted dancing lessons. But more than that, they wanted a piece of the America they were trying to help save. They wanted a college education. When she arrived back in Washington, it was during a storm, and she had to change airports. But nevertheless, Roosevelt immediately summoned her to the White House for a debrief. And she said, when I told the president this, his face lit up. These men want education. And if you look at the provisions drafted on the Servicemen's Readjustment Act in 45, 46, and 47, they're almost entirely educational in nature. The GI Bill was far from perfect, but it elevated millions of Americans into the middle class and was transformative. The last lunch that Roosevelt ever ate at the White House was just a few weeks before he died. He was due to be on the train to Hyde Park and then down to Georgia. It was a one-on-one with Anna Rosenberg. At that lunch, he ordered her back to Europe. He wanted her to continue to work with the demobilizing troops, or the plans for demobilization. Her mission, on April 12th rather, she was at the White House when she learned, as the rest of America learned, that the president had suddenly died. President Truman said, if the boss wanted you to go on this mission, I want you to go on this mission. So she found herself again in Europe in late April, early May of 1945, at the very moment of the imploding Nazi state. Her mission had to change almost immediately because General Eisenhower had liberated the first concentration camps on the Western Front. Eisenhower was aghast at what he saw, and he wired Washington to send congresspeople, send journalists immediately to bear witness to these atrocities. Of course, Anna Rosenberg was already there, so she was flown to the Nordhausen concentration camp only days after its liberation. When she went on these trips to Europe, she wore a combination of a women's army uniform and a man's army uniform. She wore man's trousers and man's parachute boots. She also carried a purse and a briefcase. As she climbed out of the Jeep that day into a hellish scene, some women prisoners approached her. They were still wearing their striped uniforms. She said they could hardly stand erect. She said, and I only found her talking about this one time, but very profound. She said, "What can I possibly give these women? I don't have any water or medicine or food." Reached in her purse. She gave a lipstick to one, a compact to another. She reached in her briefcase and gave pencils to still others and notepaper. And when she talked about this, she talked about the insufficiency of this gesture. How could you possibly give these things to starving women? But she also mentioned the look on their faces that something had been given back to them after everything had been taken from them, even their very names. There aren't too many people that I can think of that refer to George S. Patton as Georgie, but Anna Rosenberg was one of them. She was very, the generals were all very fond of her. Omar Bradley, General Eisenhower, and of course General Patton. She's here with Patton at the city of Metz. They were good friends, but not so much Patton's dog. He bit her on the backside when she arrived at his command post. In October of 1945, when the war is over, Anna Rosenberg became the first American man or woman to be awarded the Medal of Freedom, which we now know as the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Now, presidents have expanded this award over the decades, but at the beginning it was to honor civilians who had helped defeat the enemy in World War II. And Anna Rosenberg was the first American, man or woman, to be so honored. You can see the look of pride on her face. When I asked Anna's grandson, who lives, as it turns out, not far from where I live near Cambridge, Massachusetts, when I asked him over several interviews for the book what made his grandmother tick, he said not only could she get in the halls of power, the corridors of power, but she could stay there. And it's a remarkable thing, because when you think about a confidant's relationship, confidants through history, there's a mere mortal, and then there's an admiral, or a princess, or a king, or an emperor, or a general. And when the more popular, famous person dies or steps off the stage of history, the confidant goes poof. But not Anna Rosenberg. She not only became the top woman in the Truman administration after being a confidant to Roosevelt, but she helped Eisenhower pivot from soldier to statesman, and she was a 3.5-decade-long friend and ally of Lyndon Johnson. As you all know from Washington, D.C., that's not how these things work. Very, very rare, very uncommon to be administration after administration after administration. Here you see her, the President Truman is holding a report that gave him, in part, the ammunition to take the courageous act to desegregate the armed forces. One of the authors of that report was Anna Rosenberg, seen behind him. She became the top woman in the Truman administration, and here's how it happened. The year was 1950. World War II is over for half a decade. Anna was back in New York. She was back with her husband, Mike. She was back with her son, who also served in World War II, came back safely, and was helping his mother rebuild her public relations and later mediation business. They were getting bigger clients like Encyclopedia Britannica. Her son was recently married. Life was good in October of 1950 for Anna Rosenberg, until she opened up a letter on stationery to the Secretary of Defense. The letter began, "Dear Anna, will you consider an appointment as Assistant Secretary of Defense?" Wow. She knew she couldn't say no to the general. General George C. Marshall was a man she venerated, the architect of victory in World War II. But she also knew she had to be honest with him. She said, "General, I wear the bullseye. I wear multiple bullseyes." She said, "I don't want to be the Dreyfus affair for you and the President," referring to the case of French anti-Semitism. She said, "I'm Jewish. I'm Eastern European. During the early Cold War years, I speak with an accent. I'm a woman, I'm civilian, I am pro-union, I'm a former New Dealer. They're going to come after me, General, and they're going to come after you." But to his credit, he said, "We will stick through this together." Eleanor Roosevelt said the general could have picked any captain of industry, any admiral, any general, and he wanted Anna Rosenberg because she was wonderful with large groups of people, She could get to yes when other people didn't even realize there was a problem. And she knew these GIs backwards and forwards. And she could go to Capitol Hill, as she had done for Roosevelt so many times, and argue on behalf of what the president, what the administration wanted. She had all the tools. The Senate Armed Services Committee realized this and unanimously approved her. The only thing before her full confirmation was the full Senate vote, which is considered just a formality at that time because of the committee's unanimous vote. So Anna started her legendarily long days at the Pentagon. At 5 o'clock, when everybody else was leaving for the day, Anna and her staff were having tea. Sometimes she baked the cookies. And then they worked until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. She lived at the Shore Hotel for like, you know, half World War II and the first years of the Korean War. The generals, or her staff, I should say, loved her for this. She would say to them, when she found out that they were using form letters to inform families about killed in action and missing in action, she said, no, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to handwrite letters. So even though they had to work longer hours, they loved her for it. They called her Aunt Anna. But the admirals and generals in the Pentagon, not so much. They would smell the French perfume, and they'd hear the heels clicking down the corridor, and the bangles on her wrist, and they'd shut the door because they didn't want to work as hard as she was. It's at this moment when she's preparing for the full Senate vote that Joe McCarthy steps onto the stage. McCarthy was not part of the Armed Services Committee, but he had allies in the Senate, and with those allies, he postponed the full vote for 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, he and a radio personality named Fulton Lewis conjured up an ugly smear campaign that would characterize Anna as a secret communist, disloyal to her country, traitorous. The campaign hinged on the testimony of one man they found in New York, a guy named Ralph DeSola. DeSola would take the train down to Washington. The Senate Armed Services Committee would have to reopen hearings, and he would testify that he had seen an Anna Rosenberg at a communist cell meeting in New York City in the 1930s. And so this all happened. The committee reopened the hearings, and Anna was face to face with her accuser. Under questioning from Lyndon Johnson, Senator Lyndon Johnson, Ralph DeSola, Johnson wanted to know, how could you know after 20 years that that's the person that you saw in a smoky, crowded, Lower East Side meeting hall? And of course he couldn't. He didn't remember, he was clearly lying, and the senators knew it. When they called his ex-wife, she said, off the record, senators, my husband has a very, very difficult time telling the truth. They called his employer. One employer said no capacity for veracity. Another said on the record, I wouldn't listen to a word this guy says. And of course, the campaign, the smear campaign, went up in smoke just as quickly as it had been formed. Now, of course, Anna Rosenberg, being Anna Rosenberg, she always brought the data. She always brought the receipts. So she came down to the hearings with a phone book from the 1930s from Greater New York City. How many Anna Rosenbergs are in this phone book? She said. 47. There are 47 Anna Rosenbergs. There might be an Anna Rosenberg that was there that day. It wasn't me. And sure enough, J. Edgar Hoover found the communist Anna Rosenberg living in California. This Anna Rosenberg was a lifelong patriot and true to her country. What's all the more remarkable about this, as I've been on a book tour for over a year, is that this is like the first time that somebody punches back at the bully. McCarthy had ended careers already prematurely, especially women. One of his favorite targets in the early years of McCarthyism, all he had to say was, so-and-so is a communist, so-and-so has the wrong last name, so-and-so's spouse came from this country in Eastern Europe. And they didn't want to fight him. They would say, okay, well, I'm out. I'm out of government service. Not Anna Rosenberg. She was not going to let somebody call into question her very identity. She was a loyal American. She was somebody who could not say no to her adopted country as it went through these transformational decades. She's really the only person I can think of in these early years of McCarthyism that actually fought back and emerged with her career and her integrity intact. She served 26 months at the Pentagon as the Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. She doubled the size of the American Army. She reduced the points that these guys needed to come home so they didn't have to spend 2 winters in Korea. She increased combat pay. She increased provisions for the families they left behind. They loved her for it. And she went there 2 times to the battlefields of Korea, again, not as a VIP. She was there kneeling in the dirt with the soldiers themselves, saying things like, and I quote, "Pipe down, fellas, give me the lowdown." She wanted to know what the chow was like. She opened up the lid on the soup pot. She wanted to know if the socks were dry. She opened up the Foot Locker. When she first got to Korea, a journalist said, "How many black troops are serving in Korea?" And she said, "That's not the question. The question is how many American troops are serving in Korea." For these, as you can see, these integrated troops, this is, by the way, her grandson's favorite picture of his grandmother. You can see there that black soldier. His daughter or son could not go, if he was on a base down in the South, could not go to an integrated school. His child would have to be bused off base to an inferior school. Now, there was no Department of Education at this time. It was the Office of Education. But you should see those letters between Anna Rosenberg, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and the Office of Education, because she put an end to that practice in a hurry. These are federal installations using taxpayer dollars. This is against the law. President Truman, 4 years ago, had fixed this problem, and your foot dragging. So, incredibly, the military, both at home and the schools, at home and abroad, were integrated before Brown versus Board of Education, before the public schools of the country at large. My favorite box of research was the letters between the GIs and servicewomen. Many, many women served in Korea, not just as typewriter soldiers, but in communications, intelligence, and the like. And they would write very movingly, some of them, to Anna Rosenberg for giving them that opportunity to serve their country. The GIs themselves, some of them would send Valentine's cards that they buy at PX or trinkets. One mother of a GI wrote and said, "Tommy was so encouraged by your visit, I'd like to send you a ham." Anna Rosenberg wrote back, "I appreciate the sentiment, but please don't send me a ham." One unit named her Miss Wolftown in 1952. She had to beat out Doris Day and Marilyn Monroe for that honor. And you can see the look of just pride and thankfulness on her face as she's with this sergeant in Korea. Now, we all recognize who this is. This is, of course, Congressman Lyndon Johnson, Senator Lyndon Johnson, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson. When he was he hadn't even won his special election to Congress yet. It's the mid-1930s. He needed a little bit of extra money to get himself across the finish line. Anna Rosenberg knew he was a true New Dealer and wired $500 in the mid-1930s to Lyndon Johnson. He never forgot the gesture, not even when he was the President of the United States. Now, it looks like they're having a disagreement here, eyeball to eyeball. Johnson's role is to keep the military budget in check, and Anna Rosenberg's job is to do everything she can for the soldiers and their families. But they were tremendous friends for 3.5 decades. The only president that didn't use Anna to her capabilities was this one, John F. Kennedy. He saw her primarily as a fundraiser. This is despite the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt, Kennedy had to go basically on bended knee to get her support. She was an Adlai Stevenson person. So Kennedy goes to Eleanor Roosevelt, "Will you support me?" She says yes. One thing, I'd like you to maybe consider having a woman on your cabinet. Previous presidents have done it, now it's your turn. Moreover, let me give you a name. Anna Rosenberg is a well-known figure. She's been around a lot. She knows her stuff. She'd be terrific on your cabinet, but it was not to be. Kennedy not only did not have any women on his cabinet, he had virtually no women in any decision-making power up and down his administration. But like the loyal American she was, Anna Rosenberg duly raised funds for President Kennedy, including being the co-host of, I'm sure what you all know, the 1962 birthday gala, including putting together the entertainment list, which included Ella Fitzgerald and Danny Kaye and the late Marilyn Monroe. This picture on the right is from the after party that's co-hosted by Anna Rosenberg. Lyndon Johnson was there, Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe. Sadly, she would live only about 2 more months before being found dead. Anna was very, very cognizant of what she wore, how she looked. It was the bangles, it was the hats, it was always dressed very, very well. Here you can see her in a military outfit, but that scarf is clearly not a military issue. Now, some of you might say this is her office at the Pentagon on the right. Some of you might say, well, you said she didn't go to college. What are those? They look like diplomas. One of them is from a beer brewing union. It says, Anna, you wear tops. In 1959, the legendary journalist Amram had Anna on his television program. He wanted to know what it was like to be a woman at the highest echelons of business, the military, and politics. They had that discussion. Then he turned and he wanted to look at her collection of French perfume, her collection of fine china that she collected around the world, and of course he wanted to see some of those hats, which she showed him. Then he wanted to know what it was like in those heroic days of World War II, working at the elbow of President Roosevelt as the country fought a war on two fronts. And at the end of it, he had just one thing to say. He said, Anna, you have quite a book to write someday. And she said, Ed, that's a book that will never be written. It's very gratifying to me to be here with you 40 years after her death. She died in 1983. To be with you and other audiences around the country, to be talking about this remarkable career of Anna Rosenberg, who helped America achieve victory in war and prosperity and peace. Thank you for being here today.
I know you all applauded, but thank you again, Christopher Gorham, for a really wonderful presentation this morning. But I will tell you, I know there are a few who have said they've started reading the book already. It is as engaging as you were this morning. The book, not even more so, I shouldn't say that, but you really bring it alive. But it is a fascinating, captivating piece of history. As a history major in college and a lot of U.S. history under my belt, it was a piece of history I knew nothing about, and really wonderful, especially as we're thinking and looking at the world today. And I know that's something that you and I talked about a little bit. I also imagine, I know that you're back and forth this week a lot between Washington and Westford Academy. I can imagine being a student in your class. They must all be history scholars and are all going to go on to be history majors in college, thanks to you. So I'm gonna get the questions started, but also, as you know, we'll have time for Q&A. So if you have questions, I'll be able to come around, and then after Mr. Gorham fields some of those, we'll have an opportunity for those who would like to buy a book and have it copied. Mother's Day is coming up this coming week. And what a wonderful way to celebrate strong women in our lives. And so I just want to start with, you've been teaching, certainly you love history, but why this book? What was the inspiration to actually sit down and write a book?
It was six years ago. I was with my students in suburban Boston, up in the school library. We were launching our research paper project, and one of my students said, I want to write a book about the forgotten war, Korea. So I pulled a book off the shelf on the Korean War, and I just flipped it open. And there was a picture of President Truman with a big smile on his face, and standing right next to him was clearly a civilian woman because of the hat and the dress, with a big smile on her face. And the caption below said, Anna Rosenberg, Assistant Secretary of Defense, and the year was 1951. And I thought, who's this woman who is clearly on good terms with the president, who is in a top Pentagon position as a civilian, whose last name is Rosenberg at the very moment of the atomic spy case, and it's during the Korean War, and she's at the Pentagon. So I said to my students, write down Anna Rosenberg, we're going to research her. A few days later, my students said, Mr. Gorham, we can find no books on her. So we found out that her papers had been left at Harvard in 1987. So my wife and I one day, in fact it was April 19th, April of 2019, my wife and I met these students down at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, which is not far from where I live, and the librarians wheeled out the boxes and gave us the gloves, and within a few minutes, one of my students said, Mr. Gorham, look at this. It was a citation from Truman making Anna Rosenberg the first American to be honored with the Medal of Freedom. Just incredible. And then 5 minutes after that, I was holding a business card in my hand. It said on one side, Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, and on the other in blue ink, it said, Dear Anna, when you're next in New York, let's have lunch. And it was like struck by lightning. You know, this has to happen, and I'll do it.
And how long did it take to actually do the research and the writing?
I was on the bus. I live right across the street from the bus stop that goes to Harvard. I was on the bus on Saturday down to the library, and after 1 year, I had an agent. After another year, we had a book deal. And it's been an incredible ride and very gratifying, too.
Wonderful. We're going to go to questions in one moment. The last question for now I have is, you've done about 85 or so presentations. You said you took a sabbatical to do the book tour. What's been the most surprising question you've been asked or topic that you've been asked about?
My answer is going to be a little different than the question you asked, which is also something I've learned in 85. The most surprising thing that has happened is how many stakeholders are interested in this story. Because, you know, obviously I've been part of the Jewish Book Council tour, which has been wonderful, and also profound because of the year that we're having, right? Because of what happened October 7th. But I've had, you know, I've had military audiences at VMI and the George Marshall Foundation and the presidential libraries. I've had men and women be interested in this story. I've had men with, you know, Southern drawls come up to me and say, wow, Anna's story really resonates with me. So it hasn't just been women. And it hasn't, you know, it's been different ages. It's been people, different socioeconomic strata. It's been different audiences. And I think what's so wonderful about that to me is that they realize this is an American hero. She's a woman. She's an immigrant from Hungary. She's Jewish. But she's an American hero first and foremost. And that's what resonates with so many different audiences. So that's been great to see.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes. Oh, yes. All right.
And I'm teaching high school only until Natalie Portman agrees to play her on the big screen.
Hi. Thanks for being here. It's really a fascinating piece of history. So just playing off what you just said about she's an American patriot sort of first and foremost in her mind, right? So where did her Judaism come to play for her?
Well, there's really kind of two sides to that answer. One is that her family was very, very interested in assimilating. Her family from Hungary, the minute they arrived in the Bronx, it was assimilate, assimilate, assimilate. And I think a lot of people from that generation, I think that was sort of what was drilled into them. That said, you know, the records at Ellis Island, they're Jewish. She identified and was identified by others and self-identified, obviously, as Jewish. When she was the victim of that smear campaign, it was anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-communism. She was well aware of that. She literally said, I don't want to be your Dreyfus affair. And that wasn't the only criticism or the only anti-Semitism that she faced. But she was as tough as a $2 steak. So in the research, she's just not complaining about it. But you have to know, it's very, very ugly things during the smear campaign. On the floor of the House of Representatives, congressmen calling her this Budapest Jewess, just awful, awful things. And you have to think that she felt that, and she realized that these were against her, but was not going to let that influence. She was going to serve her country, and no one was going to stop her doing that. And so very courageous. I hope that answers your question. She was not super practicing a Jew, but was identified as such, and other people certainly saw her as Jewish, both good and bad.
Hi. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation. I just want to point out to you that in the days of the 40s and 50s, there was a notorious right-wing press in America, the Journal American, World Telegram, and Sun, and they were all anti-Roosevelt. And of course, Rosenberg was a great friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and some of the attacks on her was not a question of anti-Semitism, it was anti-communism and anti-Roosevelt. And I wonder if you'd comment on that, because I think that's important. And the point is that as far as the McCarthy Committee is concerned, remember, Roy Cohn, David Shine, and RFK were his aides. Thank you.
Yes, that's a great point. When McCarthy was after her, a number of letters were sent to the Senate Armed Services Committee. Huge stacks of letters, many of them from extreme right-wing writers, hate sheets that were printed up in garages. This terrible stack of documents saying that, you know, we can't have this Jewish woman as the, quote, dictator of the Pentagon. On the left-hand side were letters in support of her. And it was not just New Dealers. It was, you know, it was the Rockefeller brothers. Nelson Rockefeller, the Republican 4-time governor of New York State and vice president of the United States, said, everything I've ever amounted to in Washington, I owe to Anna Rosenberg. So you have unions, you have literally the Rockefellers, you have Dwight Eisenhower, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, writing letters in support of her. So part of what allowed her to be in Washington for so long and to be successful in Washington as an advisor for so long was that she had allies across the spectrum, which just was enormous. And maybe that gave her the courage, or helped give her the encouragement to fight McCarthy and the other people that wished her ill.
Real quick, she was in the working in the administration and defense during World War II. At the end of 1942, reports came out about the Shoah and the systematic and brutal killing of the Jewish communities, destruction of the Jewish communities. Did she respond to that in any way? That was sort of missing from your presentation. Did she know about it, and did she keep quiet, or did she say anything, or what do you think were her motivations?
Well, I'm sure that she knew about it. She was a close friend to Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. LaGuardia's sister was arrested by the Gestapo, and her husband was killed at one of the concentration camps by a drunken SS guard. Not only that, I mean, she's from Hungary. She spoke Hungarian. Her mother kept up with, you know, the old country. So I'm pretty sure that she was aware of what was going on. I did not come across any specific conversation that she had with Roosevelt. But then again, the conversations that she had with Roosevelt there weren't really records of, the only records oftentimes between those two were these little chits that Roosevelt would write. And she said later on, I don't want to say too much because I want you to buy the book. But, you know, those chits don't survive. So I didn't come across any evidence that she had that conversation with him. It doesn't mean it happened. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. I was unable to find out that evidence. There's two other things going on. One is, you know, he's got Henry Morgenthau, he's got Ben Cohen, he's got Felix Frankfurter, he's got a number of Jewish advisors. And scholars much better than me have written about this. You know, FDR and the Jews, and what was said, what wasn't said, what efforts were made. One tantalizing but yet unprovable thing happened in January of '45, and that is this. Morgenthau, the Secretary of Treasury, kind of put his foot down with Roosevelt. He walked in and said, we need to have a war refugee board set up for the victims of the Holocaust. That was January '45, forget the date. 2 days after that, Roosevelt has a one-on-one with Anna Rosenberg. The next day, he has another one-on-one with Anna Rosenberg, and like the next day, he signs into law that executive order. It was obviously too little too late. I think these Jewish advisors, perhaps even including Anna Rosenberg, felt like they would lose access to the president if they brought this up, which doesn't excuse anything. What it does is it says, who were we as a people at this time when people close to the president who were Jewish could not be honest with the president about what they knew was going on. So, you know, just obviously a terrible situation to feel like you wouldn't have access to the president if you were honest with him. I'm sorry. She did have that conversation, though, with President Truman, and it goes something like this. She was in Europe on that second trip in May of 1945 when Truman realized that the displaced persons, including hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jewish displaced persons, were being housed in the American or Allied-run DP camps sometimes along with their former assailants. This is a terrible thing, right? Truman says to this guy, Earl Harrison, he says, I want you to go up to Europe immediately. You're going to interface with Anna Rosenberg. You're going to get this sorted out now. So she did that. She made sure that the DP camps were separated by ethnicity and background and so forth. And then when she got back to New York, she was asked to spearhead the SOS campaign, providing aid to victims of the Holocaust, which she did. Millions of dollars, bolts of cloth, millions of tons of, tinned food and bars of soap and the like. So she did that in the post-war years.
Considering her business, her official life, and how tumultuous and stressful and time-consuming it was, what kind of an impact did this have on her relationship with her husband, her child, her family? How did that work out?
I'll take her husband first. Mike Rosenberg, again, very, very quiet guy. The only time that the journalist who often would go to visit her at her home or apartment, the only time they ever even remarked about him was that there's this shadowy figure that's kind of walking out of the room. He was uninterested in her life in Washington. I found he only went to Washington one time. It was essentially as her driver. So he just wasn't interested. This was a very uncommon relationship at the time. She was the breadwinner. She was in the magazines. She was on the cover of some of the magazines, and he had no interest. They separated in 1956. She remarried in 1962. A lifelong Republican, but Republican at that time was Eisenhower Republican, right in the middle of the road. She remarried a man named Paul Hoffman, who was the first administrator of the Marshall Plan. And they had a wonderful 10 years together, a very loving 10 years together, real power couple, but also very loving until his health gave way. As it pertains to her son, she was devoted to him. All the evidence that I said and all the evidence from him to her was just this motherly devotion. Now, did she have a nanny? Yes. Did she have a cook when they could? Yes. He went to Horace Mann in New York, then he went to the University of Wisconsin, then he went to World War II. When he returned from the war, he and his mother helped rebuild her business, and he worked with her until she died in 1983. He died in 2000 or 2001. But by all accounts, a very loving relationship. Still, she was criticized by some elements in the press for being that mother who wasn't there with her, often very part of every week was not there with her husband and her son, because she was living at the Shoreham Hotel for part of the week during World War II and during the Korean War.
Fascinating story. You probably would have mentioned this, but was there any, did you find anything in your research about her connection to Israel, her thoughts, discussions with Truman about the founding of Israel?
She was scrupulously silent about that, and I think I know why. And part of why I think this is I was recently out at the Truman Presidential Library, and I talked to some of the docents about this very question. She did not go on the record about the birth of Israel, and I think I might have an idea why. And the why is Truman and George Marshall did not see eye to eye on that issue. So she had, she just thought the world of both of these guys, and I think she wanted to stay out of that discussion. What she thought was not important. I mean, she even said, and I quote her, I am happy to get to resolutions. I'm happy to get to yes, but then I'm happy to fade out of the picture, which is a large part of why she disappeared from history. But I think on that specific issue, I think she was resolutely silent because, Marshall was not in favor, Truman was in favor, and she just wanted to be out of that decision.
I'm interested in the very first story you told. I want to know if she won that argument on behalf of the boys' schools, or did they go on strike?
She did. There was no strike. There was a reporter there who said, this is going back to 1917. There was a reporter there who said, who is that? I think he said, use the word girl. Who is that girl with the forceful personality? And someone looked over and said, that's Anna Lederer. She's like a Roman candle. So that gave the title to the first chapter, Roman Candle. No, she was going beyond what even her own grandson said, because she was his grandmother. She didn't regale him with stories about her past and World War II and so forth. She wanted to know what he'd done on his English essay, So, but going beyond even what he said, part of the magic of her was whether you were a trucker, or if you were a union guy back in 1928 in New York City, and they would say, these union guys would say, if Anna tells us something, we know she's on the level. They trusted her. The Rockefeller brothers trusted her. So it's like captains of industry. You know, if I'd hired her a week earlier, I would have saved $5,000. So she had this remarkable way, and I think it was about her conception of democracy itself. Democracy to her was, you give respect, you confer dignity to everybody you talk to, man or woman, poor or wealthy. That's just who she was. She was a world-class listener. That's why Roosevelt liked to talk to her, because he was a world-class storyteller. But she also had the wit to parry and to make people in power laugh, because she's just so brilliant.
We have a last question over here.
Thanks again for coming, really interesting. I was curious about her not going to college. You know, my parents were the sons and daughters of immigrants, and it seemed like the most important thing for their parents, for them to go to they were in Brooklyn and they went to the schools. So it was just like, was it a different era that, you know, because her parents, it wasn't like she had to go work right away. So I was curious why she didn't go to college. And then the second thing is, I'm just very interested in your own history of how you got to be a history teacher from being a lawyer. But that's maybe another question I can ask you.
The question about her not going to college, and I don't want to give away too much from the book, but I do have to say this. When she died in 1983, the New York Times got her birth date wrong. I was able to triangulate that when I was doing the research. Ellis Island, records from Hungary, just kind of doing the math with her. Her sister was always 3 years older than her. She was not born in the summer of 1901. She was born in the summer of 1899. The date's right, but the year's wrong. So she was born July 19th, 1899. And her parents, I think, were part of that mistake, because I think they wanted to get her the free education in the city of New York. So she was actually asked to leave high school by the Wadley School for Girls because she'd aged out. They found out she was north of 18. They said, you're out, off you go. I think that played a big role in why she didn't go to college, because then it was like, well, I need to get married, and there's Mike Rosenberg, and off you go. So she was very self-conscious about that for her life. Also a reason why why she was lost to history, because Frances Perkins has Penn and Columbia keeping her flame lit, but Anna Rosenberg does not have any institution which calls her, you know, their own. So it's just a fact of life, but she was very self-conscious about that. She did get a few honorary degrees, including one from Tufts. Yes, yes.
Curious, you know, you spend a lot of time with your students who I'm sure ask lots of questions, and they inspired in many ways your writing of this book. Is there a next book? Is there another topic that has been raised, something lost to history that perhaps you'll bring to light?
It's sort of, it is sort of lost to history. My wife doesn't like to say too much, but it's a World War II, it's a true story of World War II and the intersection of art and war. And also this question that I think runs through this book, this question of what decisions do you make when there is, you know, when one of the options is fascism and one of the options is democracy. What decisions do people make during that crucible? And
timely.
It is, and it's so I think in some ways they're very different characters. One's about a famous artist, and one's about, you know, a Washington advisor and confidant. But some of the themes are very similar. But it's been fun to write, and I'm looking forward to it. It comes out in October of 2025, so I hope that you'll have me back.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. Thank you to Christopher Gorham, certainly. And in a moment, we'll be in the atrium where you'll be able to purchase and have Christopher sign your books. We thank you for being here. I just wanted to also remind folks, I know some of you have already commented, this is our final Amram for this year, and we'll be kicking off in September with a very exciting opening. We already have our opening Amram Scholar Series for our 70th year. I'm not going to tell you more yet, except that it's really going to be very timely and exciting. We also want to remind people, though, that at the end of this month, on May 29th, we are holding a program here at Washington Hebrew where we will be featuring a panel. It's inspired by Franklin Foer's article, which some of you, I know, read in The Atlantic, but David Gregory will be moderating this panel with Franklin Foer and Pamela Nadell, who's a professor at American of Jewish History, and Yolanda Savage-Narva of the Union for Reform Judaism. It will be a very important conversation about our Jewish future in this moment and all that we're seeing, and certainly as we continue to see what's happening not just on college campuses, but out in the world. Important to come together to talk about not just what's happening, but what we can do and how we can be engaged and really set the tone of our Jewish future in the United States. So we thank you for being here today. We hope you'll join us May 29th. We hope you'll join us in the atrium. And thank you again to the Schwartzberg family for your support today and ongoing.